Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. I know break was a little longer, but I hope you all got at least a few nibbles in the interval and refreshed your drinks. So we're going to come back in for the Q&A, which we say Q&A, but feel free to make statements and feel free to contribute to the conversation with anything from your own experience that you feel, of course, is valid in the room. And even if you're not sure, this is, as we said earlier to Nikos, a safe space. So please feel free. I will not be ridiculing, and nor will anybody else be ridiculing anything that you have to say on the subject. The whole point is to have debate and to have it civilly, ironically, given the topic, and that's what we're looking for. I'd like to just sort of kickstart us off, if you don't mind us, Rachel, with a couple of points that, or a couple of things that I've what happened to my language? I must have clocked off at 9. Okay, a couple of interesting points that I felt, that I thought about as I was listening to the panel at the beginning. One of the things that to be discussed further, I think we were talking a little bit about the role of social media, of course, in discourse, and I thought it was a very interesting thing to say, use it as a tool, not as a terrain, which is great if you have your own opinions and then you're coming to the social media table. However, as we well know, the algorithms, and we haven't discussed the role of the algorithm in the conversation at all, but the algorithm is not just shaping people's opinions now, but it's actively, in some ways, being discursive to the general debate. We saw this in the last election with the Conservative Party adverts, which were found to be inaccurate and yet were not removed from social media. That leads us into accountability. We're not seeing the same accountability that we used to see. It was brought up to me actually by John himself that Priri Patel has in the past found to have done things illegally, lost her job, and then just gotten another one in an even better position. So when there is no accountability, that leads us to the third thing that I think that is worthy of discussion in tonight's debate is the role of emotion and the role of emotion in lieu of education. What we're seeing is that when people don't have an answer or when they don't have a reason, that they are turning to emotion. And this is also what what really drives tribalism, isn't it? Is the need to feel that you belong in the absence of knowing that you belong. And those are two very different things. So that's what I'd like to say. But I'd like to turn over to Rachel to run the floor generally. And I hope that you're all ready for that part of the conversation. Before we start, this is the conch shell, please. If you could make sure, for the sake of the recording, and of course, if you feel adamant that you don't wish to be in any final edit, please just see John at the back. But we would like just to be able to record what you are saying for our purposes. So if you could please have the microphone before you start speaking, that would be great. I'm ready to pass it to the first person that Rachel decides shall speak.
This is, as we said, a safe space. What I think we'll do to start off is take 2 or 3 questions, comments, statements, and then come back and see if we can get a bit of a debate going. So first 3, lady there who didn't want to get picked on before, gentleman here and gentleman in the front.
I just want to look at the tribalism you seem to be positing between left and right and social media, and I'm not sure that's true. So for someone, myself, who doesn't either feel left or right, and I think one of the reasons I don't is that both sides just seem to see economics as the way of describing how people think. So Ash, you talked about distribution, and that is a thing, and I think Nikos and other people in the room have talked about market economy, and that is the thing, and you just think, actually that's not how most people see themselves within an economic terrain. I think they see themselves in what much more, how am I as a Democrat, how is my culture common? I've just been reading Raymond Williams' Culture and Society, in which he's been talking about how do we come to a common culture. I sort of think people don't see themselves in these two tribes, and so you seem to be fighting with each other, but you don't seem to be talking to us. So I think that's my question.
This is the audience tribe versus the panel tribe, and I'm sorry that you feel that way. If you could pass the mic along to, yes, that gentleman there. If you want to give your name and your organisation, feel free. If you want to be anonymous, equally.
My name's Eamon. I heard a lot of statements of problems that exist, but I don't think I heard any solutions. So what opinions do you have about what are the ways of going forward, what are the solutions to the problems? Because you seem to agree quite, broadly about what the problems that exist.
Hi, it's Chris again. How do you think that the decline of physical violence within our system within our political system over the past centuries and millennia has potentially influenced the level of emotional violence we're willing to kind of inflict on one another?
Okay, before you get back on that, the middle question on solutions, we will come to that. That was going to be concluding statements, so don't jump the gun. Save your solutions until people are really ready to hear them. Nikos, left and right, economic tribes, have they broken down? Are we on Brexit and non-Brexit, open versus closed, old, young, men, women, nationalist, open? Where are our modern day tribes?
So you see, I don't completely agree that there is a division between left and right in their economic vision, because unfortunately, both of them has a very timid economic vision. So I see, for example, the climate change plans of the Tories, and basically their difference from Labour is that they think we should implement them by 2035, whereas the other party thinks we should implement by 2030. So both see human beings more as kind of these carbon footprint kind of destroyers rather than as these creators. So I think we live in, that's not mine, that's Frankfurt Radio actually, in pre-political times, which means the two poles are being readjusted. And I think in the future, the big division is, do you believe in human beings, in their capacity to think and act and write history? And do you believe in giving them the freedom to do so? So that's why, so we see, for example, some very premature attempts for coalitions. And an example that I'm not super excited about is, for example, the whole intellectual dark web. But there's something interesting in that. So you find a new topic, such as freedom of speech, which I think is super, super important, and you find people basically leaving behind their previous affiliations and say, you know what, actually it's not about this, quote, this kind of tribal thing. This topic, the topic of free speech, in its essence, is how do you see human beings? And you have new alliances based on this topic. So the positive scenario I see is that these very premature attempts are gonna become more permanent in bigger issues. So let's hope in 20 years from now, there's not gonna be left and right. It's gonna be, do you believe in human beings and their capacity to be free and think and create stuff? Or do you see them as basically carbon footprints, irrational, and in need of the nanny state all the time to take care of them? So I don't know if we're gonna get there, but this is, let's say, the polarization that I want to see. Because this is the essence of what are the two different views in the world today. Unfortunately, the view that I support, I think it's losing, but hopefully this will change.
Ash, climate justice, economic side, globalism, culture, out on physical violence. Take your pick.
Wow, I mean, so this is actually the thing where finally we can find a point of disagreement, because I think that ultimately you are more of an idealist than I am, and I think I err a little bit more on the side of materialism. So for me, it's not always about identifying, okay, so what is the difference in what people are saying? It's what are the differences in what people are doing? What are the material interests behind that which dictate uneven forms of action? So for instance, if you want to talk about different target dates by which we should decarbonise the economy, well, if you say, well, Tories say it's 2050, Green activists say 2030, Labour sort of tap dance between 2040 and 2030, you'd go, well, that seems to be a base level of agreement that decarbonising the economy is a good thing to do. When you then look at, okay, well, Labour's had real trouble fending off the influence of particular unions which represent workers in oil, gas, and airports and whatnot, and that's affected their ability to implement really effective climate policy. You go, there's a material interest. You look at the fact that even though Theresa May implemented a climate policy, we are currently on course to miss it. You might think, well, maybe there are some reasons behind that, and you can look to the economy to provide some, but not all of those answers. On this point about a kind of vulgar and reductive economism, I agree with you. I'm often seen as insufficiently Marxist by many of my friends because I think that culture, identity, and how we see ourselves in relation to other people is something that's really important. One of the things that I find really interesting about culture being a political terrain is that actually in the present day in our analysis, I think that we're way behind the thinkers of some of the 70s and the 80s. Stuart Hall, I think, was the great poet of political analysis. And one of the things that he was able to do is look at the effectiveness of certain kinds of political storytelling to reshape the economy and create a a social base for that reshaping of the economy. So I don't think it's either or. I think these things overlap and intersect all the time. Now, as for the question of political violence, so I'm just trying to take it all in one go. As for the question of political violence, you know, we live in the most surveilled age of any in human history. So just as a really basic thing of wanting to be able to do crimes and get away with them, molto tricky, would not recommend. So I think that it's less maybe about, you know, have we accepted the value of debate, and it's more about there are certain restrictions on what kinds of violence can take place. The other thing is also there has been a professionalisation of violence. So we don't really have big traditions of political violence in this country anymore, and certainly it has reduced in Europe from, you know, how it used to be, where we had political violence both the left and the right. When it comes to people who participate in violence, it is a professionalised thing. You have to join the police force, you have to join the army, and the numbers of people, you know, joining the army are smaller and smaller because it's now a professional thing, not a conscription thing. So I think that speaks to the changing role of violence as something which all citizens can participate in equally. There's a much stronger, what you would call a monopoly of violence by the state now than there has been at any other time in history. In terms of whether or not language has become more inflammatory, or the terms of the debate become coarsened because of that reduction of violence in our everyday lives, I would say, well, let's then go back and have a little look at political discourse at times where violence was much more common in politics. I'm a big old nerd, so I've been learning a lot about the Roman Empire, just up to Hadrian, so please no spoilers.
Are you reading Asa Bennett's book?
No, I'm not. I'm listening to Mike Duncan's podcast, A History of Rome. It's amazing.
Three classicists, love it.
Onto Hadrian. Don't tell me how that one turns out. I don't know how this wall thing's going to go yet. And the violence that permeated political speech in the Senate was crazy town banana pants. It was, we must crush his bones and da-da-da. And that was also reflected by the amount of political violence that there was in society. So I think I don't agree with the premise that these things have a causal relationship. I do agree that there's been a reduced role of violence in everyday life. I don't agree that that's then had a shape on discourse, because I think it was always pretty gnarly.
I didn't think that we were going to be having debates in 2019 about whether it was appropriate to throw milkshakes over people. But there you go. 3 more questions. One at the back, on the aisle, and at the front.
Okay, so
could you wait for the mic?
I just wanted to make a little historical point. This pub opened in August 1829, and on the day this pub opened, the Duke of Wellington fought a duel on Battersea Common with the Earl of Marshalsea over the issue of Catholic emancipation. No outcome of the duel was reported, but still they were prepared to fight with swords over that. So in some ways, we're not as uncivilized as we used to be. But I actually am fascinated by this concept of tribalism, because I do actually think that, you know, on the issue of Brexit, it became a very tribal issue. And I think when someone says, I'm the daughter of the left, it's a kind of tribal statement. You're kind of looking for approval from your peer group.
I didn't say that about myself.
No, I know. Someone else said it about you. And it's a kind of, you know, it's almost like, you know, you're seen as being cuddly and nice and interested in justice. Whereas if someone says, well, I'm from the Adam Smith Institution, everyone thinks, ooh, you're nasty, you're interested in capitalism and exploiting people. And in a very apologistic way, you have to say, well, actually, Adam Smith is not actually about that. He was actually, in some ways, involved in state intervention. So if you say, I actually do think that the markets have a big part to play in social justice. I mean, this is the thing that I think that the left, as a tribe, finds quite difficult to get their head around. They find it quite difficult to understand that, you know, the state is terribly inefficient. It wastes a lot of money. And yet, if you actually say, I like markets because they allocate resources in a fairer way than if it's all left to the state, you're seen as kind of a pariah. And this is what we've lost. We've lost this ability to talk to each other in a way, yeah, I understand your point, I want greater social justice, but I actually want efficiency at the same time. They're seen as different sides of an argument. So what we hope to have here is a solution. And it's for you to put forward solutions, not just complaints about the status quo, I think.
Thank you. Shall I get the Adam Smith Institute to... Got any response to that?
I always have a response, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
you-
It's my job to have
Very
responses.
quickly before we get on to
I just want to
conveniently
say,
the guy next to you.
John did a better job of selling my job than I did, frankly. In fact, the CEO of the homelessness in Westminster Charity, as we were leaving the room earlier, you know, I said to you, we're doing a paper on homelessness. In fact, looking at some of the benefits actually of housing first policy that Andy Burnham's doing up in Manchester, but also has been done by the Finnish government. We're not all about the idea that the state doesn't have any role in the market. We look at what works, why it works, and then advocate whether it should work, what can be done, whether it should be done by the state, whether it should be done by private companies. And so actually we're a bit more nuanced, which is why we describe ourselves as neoliberal, even though it's a bogey word on some of the parts of the left. But do you mind if I quickly nab in on something that you guys were saying earlier? I find this panel really fascinating because Ash is someone who likes the idea of revolution, change, total societal change. I find it really fascinating that you were sort of sat there going, but it's fine that we are who we are and that we are tribal, that we do like fights, for someone who genuinely wants dialectical change. I find it really fascinating that Nikos is someone who wants ideas and battles. You were also, like, by virtue of being from a Randian background, are quite tied identitarily to one particular philosophy and idea. Even though, yes, you're open to others and fights, you both come from quite different backgrounds and therefore are sort of fighting beyond one another to an audience, which I found really fascinating. For whilst you're not really trying to persuade each other. You're just trying to persuade an audience.
I actually thought that we were dangerously agreeing.
We found the common ground on this
But
stage.
that's because we're
Yeah,
talking
it's
about
awful.
relationships and stuff. So
Okay. Comment there and then comment at the front and then you can agree or disagree.
I'd say that politically speaking, I'm probably much closer to Nikos than I am to Ash, but I found more contestable things said by Nikos than Ash necessarily.
This is how we get you.
I think you've got a really idealised view of what politics was like before the century. You're talking, it was all about battle of ideas, and that was the key thing. I don't know what sort of period of time you're perhaps looking at there, because if you look at the 1960s, when party membership was at the highest for both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, people were far more tribal in that sense, born Labour or die Labour. If you look at fragmentation of politics, the normal indicators of, you're born from this particular background, you'll therefore vote Labour or you'll vote Conservative. That's far less of a thing. It's still a bit of a thing, but it's far less of a thing than it used to be. And the idea of people being toxic, Gladstone and Disraeli, Disraeli stealing the Chancellor's robes so that Gladstone couldn't wear them and keeping them in his country house for, where they've been for about the past 200 years or whatever. I don't really see when. I mean, ideas are always important, but I don't see a point at which ideas were the kind of idealised way that you presented it.
Move the mic up towards the front.
My name's Sandy. I wanted to ask about a phenomenon that's associated with tribalism and social media that elicits both positive and negative feelings in me. And that's the phenomenon that's been called doubling down, where someone digs their heels in and amplifies both their views and their behaviour in response to opposition. Now, part of me associates that with a certain sort of brittleness and intractability in social media that's not a good thing. But at the same time, I think it's sort of perhaps a degraded form of what used to be, and still is, a very positive political quality, which we used to call holding the line, which is a matter of having integrity and robustness, even under pressure. And I think it's also a sort of the pendulum swinging the other way, because it felt during the 90s and noughties as though there was an awful long time where if somebody was complained about by the prevailing sort of, orthodoxy, they would very soon either lose their job or apologise, or both. And often one had the sense that their apology was insincere. So although I feel a bit guilty at being vicariously happy when people double down in a crude way, which is someone like Donald Trump, that's what he's like on Twitter, I prefer it to what we had before, and I suspect it's connected to what could be, again, a better a value or phenomenon of holding the line. But I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts on that.
Well, Keynes famously, I think, never said, when the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do? I'd like there to be some ground in the centre where people are allowed to say, yeah, actually, you've convinced me. Right, Nikos, any of that inspire you?
Right.
I think you've got a mic.
Oh, yeah.
You've got 2 mics.
Doubling down on the mic.
I'm gesturing as if I'm going to say something super. Right. So
Making sure that no one else can speak.
So yeah, I'm not idealizing the past. But for example, if you take the 62, I think, election in the state, Goldwater versus Johnson, there you have a political division. There's a guy who openly stands, I stand for capitalism, for whatever this is, and you have someone who says, no, I want a completely different thing, I want the big society. Or if you take the first Thatcher elections, for example, then you have a very clear division. So I'm not saying that this was an ideal time, and of course, people were they were really into it. And I have a lot of communists in my family in Greece. And Greece being a communist, by the way, doesn't mean I'm Labour. It means I'm a Marxist-Leninist. And it's very interesting to go to their old books. So you have people who are workers, and they read Marx, they read Engels, they try to read dialectical materialism. So it is really polarized, but at least that person says, my worldview is something completely different from your worldview. That's why we go in the mountains and we fight literally each other with guns, because this is an issue of life and death, because our ideas are very, very different. What I'm not convinced here today is that it's so much about ideas. That's why you have the rise of the culture wars. The rise of the culture wars is a very privileged terrain for the left and the right, because it's the only issue that they can very strongly disagree about. So it's actually easy, for example, if you're a conservative Christian in the United States, you're not going to support capitalism, because supporting capitalism means you have to go against a lot of the things that the church is saying, for example. Or you're not going to support a free market, because this would mean that I have full control on my body, which means I can take heroin, cocaine, whatever. And no one should tell me that I will go to prison for that. So because this has been given up, they kind of withdraw to the easy battlefield, which is the culture wars. And that's why I think it's not a coincidence that as big fundamental differences kind of go in the background, the more fanatical we become with the culture wars. That's why I find the culture wars a bit kind of sad. Quite often it's very important. For example, if it's about, I don't know, the gay wedding, whatever, that's very important. But when it becomes the existential prism we see the world, I think there's a problem there. Now, on your point on whether you should hold the line, again, I think it has to do you take your ideas seriously? I remember after the Civil War, okay, I'm going to praise the communists, that's weird. But anyway, so the leader of the Communist Party goes to court and says, I take responsibility for every single act that a member of the Communist Party did during the Civil War. So this is basically saying, I take my ideas seriously. Now, we should say, okay, doesn't mean that this makes you a good person. So, for example, we had Nazi war criminals in the trial saying, I take responsibility. This by itself does not mean that you're a virtuous person. But I think there is something to at least that, again, I have some ideas that I fight for, and I stand by these ideas. Now, the question is, where is the line? Because if the idea that you fight for example, is the eradication of the Jews, then that's not virtuous anymore. But the fact that I believe that, and I take the idealist thing as a compliment, because I do think that ideas change history. So I think that I'm not going to back down if I'm convinced that I'm right. There's an intellectual who said something very interesting. They asked him, what's your biggest worry? And he said, my biggest worry is being wrong. Not in terms of I'm wrong, I'm going to lose face, but I'm wrong, so that all this kind of energy I put into that is going to be proven that it's for nothing.
Quickly, so we can go back, because I think I saw like 5 different hands there.
I mean,
any of that?
I guess I want to respond to your point about the sort of social meaning which is attached to declaring one's ideology. So it's funny that you say, oh, you say that you're a leftist and people read you as very cuddly. I don't think anyone has really said that I was very cuddly ever. In fact, quite the opposite. People perceive me as a very angry, strident, harpy, droning on and on, moralizing kind of person. And in terms of, my own interaction with the world vis-a-vis politics, it's one of intense conflict and hostility. And maybe it's the case that every single person who holds strongly to their point of view feels that they are being unfairly discriminated against in their social life because of it. Because frankly, I don't really buy this idea of, it's incredibly difficult to say that you believe in free markets, or it's incredibly difficult to say that you're right-wing when you look at the election result in this country, and you look at the change of seats, and you also look at the media culture in this country. That's just something which sometimes you will feel uncomfortable. That's a part of human experience of dealing with politics, in my view. Onto this question of political violence, which I find very interesting, is that, okay, so full disclosure, my great auntie was literally a terrorist, right? Literally a communist, literally a terrorist. When Britain was the colonial power in India. And it was a time where violence wasn't necessarily a tit-for-tat reciprocal thing. Violence was the lived experience of your everyday. You will have to see the starvation of your people because of a man-made famine. You'll have the suppression of political organization and political ideas. And you've got political participation, which means a confrontation with violence at some point. And rather than seeing that necessarily as, and that meant she took her ideas very seriously, I'm sure she did take her ideas very seriously. I'm sure that she took ideas around self-determination and sovereignty and culture very, very seriously. It was also a matter of survival. And so that's what I mean by thinking about how we reconcile two ways of interpreting historical phenomena between the idealist and the materialist. I reject a sort of, like I said, a vulgar Marxism which says, well, all of it is the price of grain and the price of gold, and that's that. Ideas play a huge part. But thinking about ways in which perhaps we are all of us less original than we think. And we are perhaps more constrained by the conditions in which we make history, to paraphrase Marx, than our grand ideas for reshaping history. That's my point.
Okay, who have we got? Basically everyone in the audience, starting at the back, I think. Let's have more than three. Let's start on that side and then come to that side. Right, at the back first.
Hello. I just wanted to make a case for civility on the basis of strategy, insofar as I don't think incivility in politics works. I just don't think it works. I mean, Ash is absolutely right to talk about examples from the past where this is not a new thing. It's always been the case because politics is about conflict. And you're talking about very sensitive issues, and people are they're going to take it personally. And we talk about things about austerity and stuff. I mean, obviously, people are going to take that personally. Wasn't it Nye Bevan who called all Conservatives vermin, I think? So
lower than vermin.
Lower than vermin, right, okay. Which is a bit like David Lammy saying the ERG are worse than Nazis, right? So this stuff is not, it's not a new thing. It's been amplified by social media. But I think it's perfectly possible to be robust in debate without being hostile in debate. And I think we've learned from the various examples from Donald Trump's election, Hillary Clinton referring to people as deplorables, etc., the UK media referring to Brexit voters as racist routinely. It doesn't work, just on a purely pragmatic level. No one is ever persuaded by being insulted. And you mentioned the videos where someone's destroyed someone. I mean, who is that really affect? No one's ever been persuaded by those videos. That just panders to the people who already have a preconception about or want to see that person destroyed. So I just think on a pragmatic level it doesn't work. I think we can't argue if we're just throwing insults. You just put up an immediate barrier so nothing can be achieved. I think most of the people in this room will probably share this experience, but 90% of my engagements on Twitter that are arguments are people who have failed to accurately characterize my position. So I'm spending most of my time just clarifying what I actually think, as opposed to what the opponent has imagined that I think. And I'm sure, Ash, you're the same. I'm sure you've had that experience a lot.
I'm raised by social workers. Every single argument is, you don't disagree with me, you're just not listening hard enough.
Right. But I think they're right. I think
my mum's going to love you.
No, but I think if people are simply insulting, mudslinging, mischaracterizing, straw-manning, then there is no debate to be had and there is no progress to be made. So I would say civility is actually the only way, from a selfish, strategic position, to advance our own ideas.
Gentleman next to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Piers. I'm glad Andrew's just mentioned civility, because I wanted to make something of civility in the context of tribalism, and also the question of who you can be friends with. It strikes me that most people can actually be quite civil to most other people, because most people are not members of the talking classes. You know, we're in this room because we've been invited because we are supposed to be members of those classes. But most people are getting on with their lives in an ordinary way. But there are questions about friendship, though, which are interesting. And I think I have to admit that although I take a sort of fairly, you know, libertarian line about opinions and so on, there are certain people I would find it hard to be friends with. And I have to ask myself why. I mean, one reason I've discovered, looking to myself, is that when I think someone probably dislikes me, it's actually because I dislike them. And once I realise that, and they're actually quite nice to me, I actually correct myself and say, oh, this person didn't dislike me at all. This is my projection. But when it is difficult to be friends, as opposed to just minimally civil, it's not because of whether you're left or right or religious or non-religious. It's whether you have a tribal mind. And by that I partly mean you have to look into the psychology of it. Are you the kind of person who always reacts with saying, where does that view come from? Which interest does that protect? Rather than, what's the argument for this?
Who funds you?
Yeah, exactly. Who funds you? Cui bono? I mean, that's a good question in itself. But if your only question is cui bono, where are you coming from? X says that, and X is a fascist. Therefore, what you're saying, because you agree with X, you're a fascist. When you get people to reasoning that way, as Andrew said, it alienates people, and it shuts down critical discussion, and it's against what we call a principle of charity. You know, always assume that the person you're talking to is not an ogre unless proven otherwise. And I think it's very hard to be friends, unfortunately, with people like that, although we should try to be, if possible.
Thank you. Moving at the back.
Hey, my name's Ollie. How much does the media bear responsibility for the rise in tribalism, and how far a role should it play in fixing divisions?
I mean, you've got 3 media people on your panel, so no responsibility whatsoever. Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. So I was wondering, like, maybe we're being a little bit too British-centric in this debate. I've just read a really fantastic book by Amy Chower called Political Tribes. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's a really great book. But tribes, like tribalism's a human instinct. It's everywhere. It's in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. And I think ultimately good politics is about managing it, that human instinct, because that's so problematic historically in terms of causing war and conflict. And I personally think, just from reading like psychology about like social psychology, the answer always has to be ideological integration. Like what we're doing tonight, you know, mixing in a room, like people of different political spectrums. So I think that's like the main political thing that people can add, like about how we actually encourage that. But ultimately, it's not. I don't know. I wouldn't say it's about economics. It just moves into lots of different areas. But maybe like we should, I don't know, consider why it happens everywhere across the globe. Like how do we fix this human instinct? Because it's not just Britain.
I forget who it was who said it, but someone said that if you want to observe the niceties of social etiquette, don't go to a duchess's tea party, go to a prison. And I think the point being that once you narrow the bandwidth of the things you can control, the things that you have actual control over become incredibly important. And I wondered if you thought that part of the reason that social and political discourse has become so high stakes and so vicious at times is because externalities have reduced the number of things over which people can control.
I mean, I would be inclined to agree with that, particularly with your points about the culture wars, is thinking about culture has become perhaps one of the only terrains where people feel they can exert some kind of control. I also don't think it's really a coincidence that the rise of culture wars, and how I define culture wars really is micro events. So it's less about Black Lives Matter, agree or disagree, and it's more about, Meghan Markle, yes or no? Tea. Or Yorkshire tea, or, any one of these things, these micro events which become amplified on social media. And it's because it allows you to sort of experience politics at this sort of strangely granular level. It's sort of, you're able to like grip onto it in a way, and it takes up your time and takes up your imagination. And I think that these are, it's what you'd call a feature, not a glitch of social media. It's a feature, it's not a problem of it. I think trying to like take on lots of these questions at once and thinking about civility as a tactic, well, that would, I think, yes, you have to assess all of these things strategically. I don't always get the matter of strategy right. But I also find it funny when one of the things which has become most successful in terms of the elevation of a particular kind of right-wing politic is also the caricaturing of one's opponent. So the idea of woke politics, right? I always ask people, like, what is woke politics? And it's everything from, you know, one edge of like a vegan sausage roll all the way to like Greta Thunberg, and then including Black Lives Matter and the issue of trans rights, blah, blah, blah. So the way in which all of these things can become totemic or ciphers for for a wider set of political values, in that is an element of caricaturing, and in that is an element of, you know, incivility, right? Of mocking and of parody. And so I'm okay with having a discussion where the premise is the left being where it is, should they participate in this or not? What I'm less comfortable with is the idea of taking these things as a moral position when, like I said, everyone has their hands dirty in these regards. All of us indulge in forms of stereotyping, caricaturing, parodying, and bad faith interactions with our political opponents. This is a very long and old tradition in politics. And I guess the one thing that I want to finish on in terms of solutions is I started my talk by saying we shouldn't think about politics as an extension of a debating club. I truly believe that. One of the things which I think we've really missed in this conversation is what kinds of spaces have been arenas for political debate. And in some ways, I think because of the sort of historic weakness of things like the anti-racist movement and the feminist movement, which existed in real life spaces and not just, you know, on Tumblr, the demise of the trade union movement, the lack of things like community centres, neighbourhood spaces where people can go and talk, is that on the one hand, we have the professionalisation of political discourse, right? So, you know, chattering classes, professional talking heads. And on the other, you've got a democratization of political speech through social media, which is historically unprecedented. And there is a fundamental tension between these two things. And I think unless we can come up with a real life solution to or synthesis of these two things, which involve not just the democratization of being able to speak about politics, but the real life construction of spaces in which people can also be heard, in which they can make politics, we're always going to come up with these, oh, it's a crisis of civility. I don't think that. I think it's a crisis of political space.
Nikos, you had some thoughts I saw on
internationalizing. Is this our parting thoughts?
Would you like it to be? Would you like to do that and the
It
media?
can be, because then I'm going to throw my best
up.
line now, and then I'll have nothing to say.
Excellent. Go
right.
for it.
So, and I think what made it interesting is Charlotte's point about tribalism being an instinct, which is what Sua is basically saying, and also relates to the question about what can we do. So I think tribalism is not an instinct. It's just the obvious choice. It's the easy choice. And it's the easy choice because the alternative is very difficult, and the alternative is independent thinking. So I think the way out of tribalism is this very difficult thing, which is thinking about yourself and taking responsibility about your thinking. And this is very difficult because then this means you also take responsibility about your life, which is a weight which quite often it's unbearable, but it's the only way to lead a humane life. So I would say not that tribalism is our nature. Actually, our nature is to be independent. That's why we have this thing called like reason. That's what it means to be human. Being human means I use my mind to take decisions and act on these decisions. So the only way out of tribalism is to be this independent thinker. And it's very difficult. I agree with you. Like living in Iran today is not as easy to be an independent thinker as if you live in, I don't know, an idealized view of ancient Athens, I don't know, minus slavery or whatever. Like a good.
Ancient Athens had its own issues.
I know, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So it is difficult, but at the very, 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 very end of the day, in Tehran today, you have women who throw away kind of the symbols of what they see as the symbols of their oppression. Or you had, during these difficult times, you had Galileo saying, you know what, everyone is wrong and I'm right. Why? Because my mind is telling me so. Because a lot of people might say, you know, I stick this to the world, everyone is wrong and I'm right because I feel so. No, Galileo said, I use my mind and my mind is telling me, all of you are wrong and I'm right. And I think that's the most humane thing someone can do. And that's the way out of tribalism.
Well, I just wanted to end by saying, someone mentioned free speech. We had a conversation about how you can speak freely and disagree freely. You've got the right to say whatever you want. You don't have the right to be listened to, and you've just spent 2 hours listening to us. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, thank you so much for coming to the second London Symposium. Could we please, before I invite you all to join us for a drink downstairs in the basement, give it up one more time for our lovely panel, Ash, Rachel, and Nikos. Could I also say, if I don't already have your email address and you would like to be on the list, please come find me and I will add you to the mailing list for future events. Could we also give it up yet again, please, for the lovely Sekforde and for David for hosting us here and giving us, and being such wonderful hosts. And last but not least, can you give it up for yourselves? Because let's be honest, without you, the second half would be woefully quiet. So give it up for yourselves. My name is Ria Lina. I will see you in the basement for drinks. Thank you so much.